So hello, my name is Jen Riley. I'm a senior transportation planner at the Connecticut DOT in our agency's sustainability and resiliency group. My job is focused on reducing carbon pollution from the transportation sector, and I serve as the department's electric vehicle subject matter expert. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to give you a brief rundown on the bipartisan infrastructure law as it relates to the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, formula program. And I'll also be telling you how you can get involved in shaping our state's fast charging electric vehicle plan. So before I get started, I just want to remind folks of a couple of things. This webinar is being recorded. We'll also be posting a copy of this webinar online, both on YouTube and on our NEVI webpage in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. Everyone has been muted for the presentation, but we ask that during question and answer, unless you have a question, please stay on mute. If we stop this presentation for any reason, please rejoin using your registration link. And due to FOIA and public access laws, we appreciate if you refrain from using the chat feature. Instead, the question and answer field at the bottom of the participant panel will be used for public comment, and questions can be added anytime during this presentation. And at the end, we will answer questions from the Q&A field. Please note that if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you after the presentation. And we have about 1 hour slated for this call. So without further ado, let's get started. So these are the key subject areas I'll be covering during today's call. The federal goals around advancing electric vehicles and building a nationwide network of EV chargers. I'm going to be providing background on the IIJA National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, funding requirements, which have been set by the federal government. I'll also go over what investing in DC fast charging would mean for Connecticut and review the vision and goals of the plan. I'll also discuss phase 1, which is mainly focused on building out chargers along Connecticut's alternative fuel corridors. And then I'll talk about prioritizing fast charging zones along our interstates. Then lastly, I will touch on steps and next steps and how to stay informed and how you can submit us your comments. So we have them as we develop our plan to help advance a fast charging network in our state. So in August of 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14037 that calls for electric vehicle or zero emission vehicles or electric vehicles to account for half of new vehicles sold in the United States by 2030. The US Congress has made it clear that they are serious about addressing climate change through federal policy measures and by ensuring through the federal infrastructure bill, known as the IIJA, that there is dedicated funding in place that's aimed at building out EV charging infrastructure across the country. So the good news is that the OEMs, or the car manufacturers, are really beginning to get on the zero emission bandwagon and are really ready to produce more electric vehicles to meet the mass market expectations. And you can see from this graph from the International Energy Agency that globally, the number of battery electric and plug-in hybrid and fuel cell electric light-duty vehicles like cars and vans are expected to rise rapidly in the coming years. And here in the United States, we really need to ensure that we have the infrastructure in place to handle the EV revolution that is coming our way. So the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program, is focused on developing a national EV fast charging, or DCFC, corridor over the next 5 years. In total, $5 billion was set aside for this program at the national level, and Connecticut is receiving approximately $52 million in formula funding that will be coming to our state over the next 5 years. The amount allocated to Connecticut in year 1 is $7.7 million. Now keep in mind that the NEVI program that I'm discussing today is related to the federal formula program. There's also a discretionary grant program, which is a separate competitive grant program for EV charging and fueling infrastructure that will probably be released at the federal level later this year. I won't be covering the discretionary program opportunities today. Instead, the focus of this presentation is on formula funding coming to the state DOTs. And it's important to realize that before any money comes to Connecticut, that we are required to submit an EV infrastructure deployment plan to the newly formed Federal Joint Office of Energy and Transportation by August 1st of this year. And it needs to be approved by the Joint Office before we can start building out any of the actual EV infrastructure. So like I mentioned before, the NEVI program is focused on developing a national EV charging corridor. With that goal in mind, the newly created Joint Office of Energy and Transportation has created NEVI-specific guidance, which sets the rules for all states to follow. You can actually find this guidance online. There's a link right here at the bottom of the slide, but really these are the main things that must be covered during the start of the program. The law requires that we prioritize putting the DC fast chargers at locations along the interstate highway system, specifically along alternative fuel corridors. Per the FAST Act of 2015, state and local governments nominate these corridors for federal highway approval. I've included a map of all Connecticut's alternative fuel corridors on a future slide. So we'll get back to that in a minute. But really, we need to ensure also that there are 4 150 kW chargers that can simultaneously charge 4 electric vehicles at the same time. This is not currently the case, looking at many of the DC fast chargers in operation right now. But it will help to ensure that if you stop to get a charge at one of these new locations, the odds of a driver finding an available charger are much higher. Also, the ports need to be combined charging system, or a CCS. This is the most common type of port that most vehicles on the road can utilize at this time. And per the guidance, the charger needs to be located within 1 mile from the interstate ramp. It's also important to note that per this new guidance, that, like I mentioned before, that the state DOTs are required to develop and submit an EV infrastructure deployment plan that is compliant with the DOT guidance. And the plan must be approved at the federal level before any station projects and investments may begin. The guidance also emphasizes equity considerations to be included as part of the plan to ensure states are planning equitable charging experiences for all users. The guidance itself is 31 pages long, and it contains a great deal of information about the program. But we expect to learn even more in May when additional information and guidance is released by the federal government. So NEVI and state transportation planning. The NEVI program is to be administered as a federal aid highway program under Title 23 of the United States Code, Chapter 1, and federal funds will be capped at 80% of project costs. All projects need to be programmed in the relevant TIP and STIP, and we must have completed all state and federal environmental reviews for each project. Because NEVI funding comes from the general fund of the Treasury and not the Highway Trust Fund, states cannot transfer any of the NEVI funds to other highway programs. So before we get too far down the road about talking about electric vehicles and fast charging infrastructure, let's take a minute to review what investing in DC fast charging could mean for the average EV driver. Most drivers are familiar with different grades of gasoline, like regular, plus, or premium. But what about electric vehicles? Is there different grades for fuels for them? So electric vehicle chargers are characterized by levels rather than by grades. The levels describe how quickly a charger will recharge an EV's battery. In general, chargers are defined by the number of kilowatts they output. Each kilowatt hour received by a standard passenger-sized EV equates to about 4 miles of driving range. The higher the output from the charger, the faster the EV battery will be able to recharge. So for this plan, we're mainly focused on DC fast chargers, or those fast chargers, level 3, sometimes referred to. Level 1 chargers are typically chargers found at residential homes, where level 2 chargers are typically found either at the residential setting, but most typically found at workplaces and other commercial locations. Those DC fast chargers are the fastest chargers available, with a maximum output of 350 kW, and they're typically located at public and commercial locations. Per this NEVI guidance that I mentioned earlier, all the funds dedicated for this program are aimed at installing DC fast chargers, the level 3 chargers, and the power level needs to be at a minimum of 150 kW, which delivers approximately 125 miles of range in about 15 minutes. The maximum charge rate is oftentimes limited by the EV acceptance rate, or how quickly a battery can take a charge. And there's a special note to people who might be interested in purchasing or leasing an EV. This is a feature that you can add as an extra option when purchasing an EV to be able to take that faster charge on some models. So if you look at this graph here, you can see there are many EVs currently on the market that can charge at the 150 kW level. And there are even newer EV models capable of charging over 200 kW. In this chart, I pulled out the average range of vehicles currently on the market, including Tesla vehicles, and the average not including Tesla vehicles. And it's to give you a better glimpse into the average range and charging capacity of the cars on the road right now. Unfortunately, there are very few public charging stations capable of delivering the highest level of power accepted by some of these cars on the road today. That being said, these higher chargers, like the 150 kW chargers and the 350 kW chargers, can still be used by other electric vehicles. It's just at a slower rate of charge. I think another aspect to keep in mind when we're thinking about EV charging are that the billing rates that are being used to like who's in control of them. And they're determined by charging networks or site hosts, and they can vary from 10 cents a kilowatt hour to over $1 a kilowatt hour. And when I was doing this analysis, I found that the average is about 35 cents a kilowatt hour nationally. But if you're using the average rate of that 35 cents a kilowatt, a full charge can vary considerably from $10 to $30, depending on the EV battery size. All right, so now let's turn to plan development. This is a brief rundown on the types of items that need to be included in the state's NEVI plan per the federal guidance. I'm not going to read through them all, but I really wanted to show you a glimpse of what we're being asked to prepare for in this plan. And I think it's important to point out that we have a very short time frame to complete our state EV plan. We need the final plan to be back in USDOT and DOE's, the joint office hand by August 1st of this year. One of the items that is emphasized in the guidance is ensuring that we have looked into the different ways to involve the public in helping to plan for charging build out within our state. Remember, this is just the first year of a 5-year program. So we're just at the beginning of our planning. So if you have ideas on ways we can step up our public outreach to reach more people, we'd love to hear your feedback on that. And after we submit the plan, the joint office has until September 30th to notify states whether their plans are adequate. If they are, the states can start spending money that should be apportioned to them in October. If this state plan is not adequate, the state has to do more back and forth with the joint office to get an approved plan. As with every good plan, it's important to have a strong vision statement. Our vision is to create a robust roadmap for how the state intends to catalyze the expansion of a safe, reliable, accessible EV fast charging network by spurring investments in and ensuring equitable distribution of fast charging infrastructure throughout the state. Our goals surrounding this vision are to accelerate EV adoption and deployment by making fast charging convenient and providing a seamless New England EV traveler experience, and working with state and local partners to address gaps along Connecticut's highway network. We also want to provide equitable access to the benefits of electrification across the state. We want to boost range confidence, engage people in the process of plan development, and we want to ensure that we're complying with the federal program reporting requirements. And we also want to maximize investments to complement any other available funding streams. As I mentioned earlier, the guidance dictates that for phase 1 of funding, states need to focus on designated alternative fuel corridors during the first year. Since 2016, Connecticut has designated 5 EV alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs, totaling over 350 miles of roadway throughout the state. The designation includes interstates, 95, 91, 84, and 395, and part of US Route 7. We do have one EV pending corridor, and that is the red dotted line on US 7, and from New Milford to the Connecticut-Massachusetts border. And what that means was that there were not enough fast chargers north of New Milford on Route 7 to qualify to meet federal highways requirements for the alt fuel program. This map shows Connecticut's existing DC fast charging network. The little green stars are the qualifying, and the black dots are the non-qualifying stations. And it shows how they correlate to the alternative fuel corridors. So the green stars are the existing fast chargers that have the CCS connectors that were important and mentioned in the guidance. They have the 150 kW. They're located within 1 mile off of an interstate exit. And when we look at these locations that meet all these, the guidance, we only have 4 locations that meet all the NEVI requirements. And the joint office indicated to us early on that they expect states to fully build out all the state's alternative fuel corridors before expanding fast charging in other areas of the state. And they anticipate they'll be opening up other nominations for corridors in the coming years. So at this time, Connecticut has decided not to nominate any additional alternative fuel corridors, at least for 2022. There have been requests to nominate other corridors maybe in the future. And those corridors have been Route 2, Route 6, and Route 15. But like I said, we'll have that opportunity. So we decided that we should spend our focus right now on building out what we have already designated under this current program. So this slide considers where chargers are in other states and how they might help us to meet the 50-mile mark between charging banks. Currently, our neighboring states' existing infrastructure that meets the new NEVI requirement of at least having 4 chargers a location at a minimum of 150 kW and located from a mile from the interstate ramps are not super helpful in helping Connecticut fill in our gaps of the 50 miles between chargers. But our plan is to coordinate closely with our neighboring states so we don't duplicate efforts and install multiple chargers in one area. So back in January, many of you joined us for our initial EV fast charging gap analysis. And of course, this was before DOT knew anything about the new federal NEVI guidance. It hadn't been released. I'm not going to dwell on this slide very long since a lot has changed since then, but I did want to let you know that if you weren't aware that this analysis does exist, and you can find a recording of it on YouTube at the link provided. And it also might give those just joining us a bit more background on the types of data we use to complete our original fast charging gap analysis. So here we have more a recent high-level basic analysis of what 50 miles between stations would look like based on the existing fast charging infrastructure that currently meets the NEVI requirements. If, and I say if, we only look at mileage and focus on meeting the 50 miles between stations, 8 proposed zones and possibly another on Route 7 rise to the top. We were really fortunate that our initial gap analysis spurred a lot of developers and charging companies in the private sector to reach out to us and share with us their plans to install additional fast charging at locations across the state. So we expect probably a couple more chargers may come online in the near future and will really help fill in some of our gaps. And like I mentioned before, we are in starting conversations with other states to understand how they're planning their fast charger build out. Because like I mentioned, we don't want to duplicate any efforts. And we're in the process right now of analyzing all of this data. And we expect that this map might even change before August. So we know we have gaps in our charging network. How are we going to prioritize the locations that rise to the top? And why is that important? It's important because even as we're focused right now on writing this plan, we also need to be thinking about setting up an application for entities to apply to after our plan is approved. We want to ensure we're ready to hit the ground running once the joint office gives us the thumbs up that we have the okay to start accepting applications. And here are some of the reasons why that prioritization is going to be key. It's going to help us with application scoring, help us target our outreach, ensure we're providing fast charging benefits to all populations, and also support charging in rural areas. So based on our experience earlier with our January gap analysis, we anticipate that ArcGIS data will certainly help in prioritizing fast charging build out locations. And now that we have specific federal guidance citing how far off the interstate we need to put the chargers, we can use additional GIS tools to really begin to dive deeper to help identify charging opportunities and areas where fast charging installations would have a very strong case. On this slide, we used a drive distance GIS online analysis tool to provide an example of what a drivable mile off an interstate exit looks like. Now imagine overlaying other data like existing station locations, utility hosting capacity maps, destination attractions, socioeconomic data, amenities, traffic data, and also any other layers that we aren't aware of that many of you might be able to help inform us of. And it might help us to find the most opportune spot to put these fast chargers. So the questions have already begun rolling in on what our competitive grant program might look like once our NEVI program is approved. We don't have all the answers figured out yet, but this is what we do know. The program will be open to all to apply to as long as the location meets the program criteria. What will the funding look like per applicant or station? So we know we can pay up to 80% of the station's, my slide deck does not look like me. We can pay up to 80% of the station costs, but we're considering a maximum threshold for each port or station application. These are all still being decided. We've also started looking at what criteria would be important to include in a grant application. And we're working with Connecticut DEEP and PURA because they have some lessons learned from the EV charging programs that they've managed that we can help to utilize. As I stated before, if all goes to plan as planned, we should have our state NEVI plan approved by the joint office this fall, and we'd be able to roll out our grant program soon after we get the thumbs up from the joint office. I think it's important to note the Connecticut DOT does not want to own and operate these fast charging networks. We anticipate we will be contracting with private entities for the acquisition and installation of public EV charging infrastructure. So with approximately $52 million coming to Connecticut over the next 5 years to support the expansion and deployment of EV charging infrastructure, we have the opportunity to build a cohesive fast charging network for our state and also to help encourage EV adoption. To put it in perspective, as of January of this year, there are over 21,300 EVs registered in Connecticut. And over the last 12 months, Connecticut has been averaging over 600 new EVs per month. I want to leave you with this picture. The data shows that the EV market in Connecticut is growing. And now more than ever, the state needs to work with our partners and stakeholders to ensure that we're putting our best foot forward to build a network of publicly accessible charging stations that are brand agnostic, support charging for all makes and models, and are reliable and convenient for all to access. I encourage you to get involved and to help us make a charging network that is all of these things and better. So before I review what's next for this plan, I want to revisit something that came up during our first NEVI outreach session. How will the state be taking public comments and environmental justice and equity considerations into account during both the plan development and implementation? I think the first point is that we're hosting outreach and listening sessions and asking people what they think. We're intentionally engaging with people, and we have an open ear and we're listening. We are also working with various organizations across the state to gather ideas. There are a multitude of opportunities to put emphasis on equity and EGA, both in the plan development and in the plan implementation. But we want to know from you, leaders and members of communities, what questions should we be asking? What criteria should be rising to the top in our grant applications? What types of events should we be planning for over the next 4 years? Listening sessions, that could be an option. How can we get people engaged? And what does success look like? We are at the start of this program, the ground floor, and we're limited the first year on how we can spend the money because it has to be spent along our alternative fuel corridors. But we don't want to create a prescriptive grant program for the next 4 years, but instead we want to build a program that works with and for communities. And it really tries to work to minimize and understand the burdens that people feel that these EV chargers might bring to their neighborhoods. We can't do it alone, and we don't have all the answers. That's why we're reaching out and trying hard to listen to ideas that others have. That being said, what's next and how can you stay informed with what's going on with our NEVI plan? So we welcome all feedback on plan development, stakeholder outreach ideas, and any other ideas you would like to share with us. Please email us at the email connecticut.dot.evplanning@ct.gov. And we'd like to have all comments submitted by June 3rd. Remember, we have to have this plan all wrapped up and back to the federal government by August 1st. So we have a short window. And also we have our Connecticut DOT's NEVI webpage. It should be up in the coming weeks. And you'll be able to sign up for email distribution lists. You can also expect that we will be sending you lots of updates via email, and we'll be posting also as we develop them materials on our website. And like I mentioned several times, this plan requires a lot of outreach over the next 5 years because we're going to have to annually review our state EV charging plan. So we're going to be working closely with our sister agencies, and we want to work to develop a framework and a draft outreach plan. But we welcome your thoughts and ideas that you have. ensuring we're putting our best foot forward. It's really a all hands on deck initiative to try to put an EV charging plan in place that tries to meet the needs of a variety of different stakeholders. So we welcome any input you have, and I want to thank you again for joining us. And please reach out to the email listed if you have any questions or thought you would like to share with us on the development of our state EV charging plan.